This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin, bringing you stories of capitalism. This week, the business of defense, whether the United States is getting its money's worth for its military spending. Plus, turning the tables on cybercrime. We look at how law enforcement and private firms are using technology to track down criminals and even get some money back. But we start with a story about choice. The choice most Americans are making between two parties, two presidential candidates, two economic approaches, and what that choice could mean for global Wall Street. Beginning with the U.S. economy and the battle with inflation. From Bloomberg International Economics and Policy correspondent Michael McKee.
Voters face a pretty stark choice. One candidate wants to tweak but preserve the status quo. The other wants to completely remake the global economy. The U.S. came out of the pandemic in better shape than any other country. During Joe Biden's term in the White House, almost 7 million jobs were created. Unemployment fell as low as 3.4%. Inflation briefly roared, but has now fallen back to an annual rate of 2.2%. So Kamala Harris would essentially follow the Biden playbook. Invest in creating jobs and raising productivity, expand and strengthen the social safety net. Taxes would go up on corporate earnings and the rich. Inflation was a lot lower when Donald Trump came to office, coming out of the great financial crisis. Up until COVID, it averaged just 1.7%. If you leave out the COVID year, 6 million jobs were created during his term, and unemployment fell to 3.5%.
Despite inflation, despite more than 500 basis points of Fed rate hikes, American businesses seem to have done well over the last 4 years, raising the question of what they look for in the next administration. Josh Bolton works for the CEOs of the largest companies in the country as president and CEO of the Business Roundtable.
The economy's been pretty good ever since we pulled out of the pandemic. We've had too much inflation, which the Fed seems to be succeeding in bringing under control. But for the most part, the economy has been relatively successful, but not nearly as successful as it ought to be. And one reason we haven't been as successful as we ought to be is that there is just too much regulation holding back the robust vitality that American business has, over the decades, historically been able to exercise. So as our business leaders look to the kinds of policies they want to see in 2025 and beyond, regardless of who wins the election, they want to see a sensible regulatory environment that lets them do what they do best, which is make money.
Taxes are always on the minds of business leaders, but they've played an especially large role in this campaign, particularly when it comes to that 21% corporate tax rate that came from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act under President Trump. And that law is up for renewal next year.
The members of the Business Roundtable were strongly behind the 2017 tax reform, which was extraordinarily successful in lifting the American economy out of the doldrums we had experienced since the Great Recession. In the 2 years immediately after the 2017 tax reform, the median household income increased more than it had in the previous 10 years combined. So the members of the Business Roundtable are really concerned about keeping that going.
The presidential campaigns have also spent a lot of time talking about tariffs, how they work, and what they would mean for U.S. business and the economy.
Overwhelmingly among the membership of my organization, the view is that trade is extremely important to the success of the U.S. economy. Some tariffs may be necessary, particularly to counteract unfair trade behavior from some of our trading partners. But broad-based taxes along the lines that President Trump has proposed would be very damaging to the U.S. economy, and particularly those at the lower end of the income scale.
The line between economics and geopolitics has become increasingly blurred, whether it's tariffs, export controls, or industrial policy. Richard Haas of Centerview Partners has spent his career on these issues in the government and as president of the Council of Foreign Relations for 20 years.
If you're talking about large across-the-board tariff increases, not linked to behaviors, not, if you will, with a sledgehammer rather than a scalpel, you have to assume there's going to be retaliation. You have the initial effects of the American tariffs, raising costs here. It's obviously inflationary, as all sorts of economists have pointed out. But then you have the double down effects or the knock-on effects. When the others retaliate, many of our trading partners aren't going to take it in stride. So yes, you could have a trade war under a Trump presidency.
Good old-fashioned geopolitical tensions have come back in the last 4 years, with wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, and China increasing its presence around Taiwan and in the South China Sea, which has injected a new degree of uncertainty in the global economy that businesses do not like. Is there a potential risk to national security from putting too much emphasis on economics and overlooking the strategic?
The short answer to your question is yes. It turns out that stability is the basis of all else, whether it's the rule of law, whether it's balance of power, so whether it's inside a society or around the world. You can't conduct economic relations. You can't make long-term investments, for example, without confidence about the rule of law and stability. So I would say of the two, the geopolitics are the more basic.
When you talk about stability, I, being from Bloomberg, think about investment. One of the things investors want is stability. Will they get more stability out of one of these candidates than the others? A more certain world in which they can invest?
I would think under a Kamala Harris presidency, it's always dangerous to make predictions about the future, as Yogi Berra once pointed out, but you're likely to get more continuity than change. The economy's doing well. We're growing up, north of 3%. Inflation's been coming down. We've had 4 years of a Biden-Harris presidency, and I would say the arrows are heading in the right direction. So yes, you'd have some changes, corporate tax rates and so forth, but by and large, continuity would outweigh change.
America first.
I think a Trump presidency would introduce much greater uncertainty.
Global Wall Street has also watched as the debate over regulation rages between the Republican and Democratic standard bearers. The one who moves into the Oval Office in January could have a major impact on the rules governing the finance industry. That's the particular expertise of Professor Catherine Judge of Columbia Law School.
So one of the really striking features of financial regulation over the past 8 years is how little it has changed, right? So when Trump first came into office, he was the first Republican president in office after the Dodd-Frank Act. A lot of people expected dramatic change, dramatic rollback. We had a little bit of legislative rollback. We certainly did have some regulatory rollback. His vice chair at the Fed, who was in charge of these matters, Randy Quarles, was incredibly effective in terms of the strategy that he put together. That being said, if you talk to a typical banker, it wasn't a dramatically different environment that they were facing, particularly for the large banks, at the end of those 4 years relative to the beginning. Regional banks face some rollback, but not a lot.
The independence of the Federal Reserve has been much discussed during the U.S. election, though some question just how much any president could or would do to undermine that independence.
Economists say both candidates' plans would add trillions to the national debt, although the hole would be a lot bigger under Trump. Interest rates would rise along with the price level as the government had to sell much more debt. The Fed might have to start raising rates again, though Trump says he'll pressure the central bank to keep rates low, a move that might stir volatility in the markets. Now, all these are campaign promises, of course, and some or all may not happen. Many business executives here and elsewhere say Trump has a history of bluster but not following through. With the race as close as it is, however, the world is holding its breath.
So, it's interesting. Donald Trump has said that being the Fed chair is the best job in government. It is at least possible that under a second Trump presidency, it might be the worst job in government. Some of his biggest economic initiatives, higher tariffs, really limiting immigration, would have an inflationary impact. We know going back to 2019 and early 2020 that he was very vocal with his frustration that Chair Powell at that time had interest rates where they were. He wanted them to be lower. And so you can imagine a scenario where we're facing significant inflationary pressures and prices are going up, but a Fed chair has a hesitancy in really tightening interest rates and tightening monetary policy in the way that would be necessary to combat the inflation, because doing so might lose the faith and the backing of a second President Trump.
And finally, whoever becomes president in January, it will not be up to them alone to decide the direction of regulatory policy. Congress will have a substantial say, both through legislation enacted or blocked, and through the Senate confirmation process for those who lead key agencies.
You know, you can both overstate and understate this very easily. So if you actually look at significant rulemakings, President Biden has actually undertaken more significant rulemakings than any other recent president. And interestingly, President Trump is number 2. So each of them did actually work very hard to kind of bring about meaningful changes. That being said, you know, you can look at financial regulation as an example of an area where we haven't seen as significant a change as we would have expected to. So I think under Trump, we would have expected significant deregulation. We did get deregulation, but it was more modest in scope.
Still ahead, the price of protection. We discuss the changing landscape of U.S. defense spending next on Wall Street Week. This is a story about getting our money's worth when we really need to, when our national defense depends on it.
We spend an enormous amount of money, and we have the best military in the world. Is it sufficient for all of the problems we have? No.
For over 20 years, John Hamre helped oversee defense spending for the U.S. government, rising to become Deputy Secretary of Defense under President Clinton. Now he's president and CEO of the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
We do have a fine military, but it's an extremely inefficient system that we have to buy things and the way we're organized.
The Department of Defense budget for 2024 is edging toward $1 trillion, more than the next 9 countries combined. It amounts to some 13% of federal spending, or about 3.5% of total U.S. GDP, and goes toward everything from pens and notepads to missiles and fighter jets. But for all that it spends, there are plenty of people who believe it may not be enough.
As a percentage of GDP, the U.S. government is spending half as much today on defense as we did in the 1980s. We're spending 1/20th as much on defense as we did in the Korean War. So the needs are growing, the funding is declining.
Amy Ziegart is a political scientist and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, specializing in U.S. national security and defense.
I think there are 2 problems, David. One is that we're not spending enough, and 2 is that we're not spending wisely enough. We need to be spending money on low-cost, high-tech, affordable, unmanned systems and other capabilities.
How much the U.S. spends is one thing. Spending it in the right places is quite another, particularly in a world where the very nature of war is changing rapidly, as we've seen most recently in Eastern Europe.
We're watching the war in Ukraine, and it's opening up entirely new concepts of warfare that we're going to have to really figure out. And I don't think we quite yet know how to do that. But we do have a very good system for looking into the future and designing weapons for that future.
Many Americans are familiar with the Indiana Jones movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark, that famous scene where there's a machete-wielding guy in the market and Indiana Jones takes out the gun, the superior technology, and shoots him. That's been the strategy of the U.S. military for the past 30, 40 years. We're going to out-engineer the adversaries. And it doesn't matter if if we're outnumbered by them, but our capabilities are going to be exquisite, and that's how we're going to win. That's not the battlefield anymore. Now, if we're Indiana Jones in that marketplace, it's 10,000 machete-wielding guys, and some of them have guns too. And so Indiana Jones is going to run out of bullets before he runs out of bad guys to shoot. That is essentially the United States and what we face with the rising threat of China in Taiwan, the South China Sea. And war games show it. The CSIS war games show we run out of ammunition within a week or 2 in a fight with China.
For the U.S. to keep up with changes on the battlefield, it will need more than just new equipment and new technology. It will need to reform the way it procures that equipment and technology, making it more streamlined and flexible than what the Pentagon does today.
I think there's widespread agreement that the procurement process is desperately in need of modernization and revamping. So the procurement process is very good at some things. It's not very good at rapidly developing and fielding capability.
Those trying to do the innovating agree that the process badly needs reform. Andy Lowry is CEO of Epirus, a defense tech company based south of Los Angeles. He's working on a system to protect against drones like those used so effectively in Ukraine.
Bases, aircraft, tanks, cars, vehicles, stadiums, refineries, borders. All of these things right now are falling prey to an infiltration of drones, not just flying drones. You have drones on the water, drones on land, drones in the air, drones in space.
Lowry's company is one of the many so-called neo-primes laboring to help the Defense Department make the big shift from slow development of huge weapon systems to the new world of innovation and fast scaling.
We've kind of grown a little comfortable, I would say, in the way that we've been fighting this sort of war of deterrence. But now enter this new age of consumer electronics, highly distributed, highly networked. No one single thing can do that much damage, but when you add hundreds and put them in a swarm configuration, it's the new way that wars are being fought, and it's confounding our Defense Department.
Lowry says part of the problem is the size of the Defense Department itself, arguing that its scale and its procurement system may get in the way of spending its money wisely.
It's expensive to produce and maintain defense technology because, one, it's very low volume. You know, military systems, for the most part, traditionally have been low volume. They haven't had to produce a lot of them. So there's a lot of change and a lot of customization to each and every program. So that adds a lot of expense. Two is we're trying to get best in breed performance. I mean, we don't want to skimp on how high a performance that we get. So performance becomes paramount to building great systems. And so it becomes expensive to get the highest level of performance.
The most frustrating part of this story is that there are lots of really talented, dedicated people that are trying to change this whole process, and they are swimming upstream. So the late Ash Carter, Secretary of Defense, really started this push for a defense innovation unit here in Silicon Valley. Lots of people really worried about the direction of spending and the need to actually produce more capabilities on a faster cycle to adapt to the times. Members of Congress, some of them really care about defense innovation, but members of Congress, we know, care about getting reelected. And so there are natural electoral incentives for members of Congress to protect the jobs that they currently have in their district.
One path toward reforming defense spending is through doubling down on the private sector. Hamre says it has both the capital to deploy and the tolerance for risk-taking that innovation demands.
Probably the most important thing is, 50 years ago, the Defense Department invested in technology that was going to be a definitive winner on the battlefield. We're still locked in that system. But now it's the private sector where there's far more dynamic and innovative developments. But this revolution that's taking place in digital technology is in the private sector. And we don't know how to bring that into the government because we want them to slow down and fit our model. Well, they're not going to do that. Defense acquisition runs at X and the private sector is moving at 5X. I mean, their development cycles are measured in months. Our development cycles are measured in years, almost decades.
Part of the answer to encouraging faster innovation may lie in adding more companies to the mix. Since 1990, the number of defense prime contractors has plummeted, going from 13 in some weapons categories to no more than 3, and in some categories to only 1 or 2.
If we were talking in the 1990s, we would have had dozens of big defense companies. That helps competition, it helps innovation. Now there are 5 defense primes. We've had massive consolidation of the defense industry, and that means prices are likely to go up and knowledge gets lost and innovation is slower than it otherwise would be. Do we need more companies in defense? And the answer is a resounding yes, we do.
One reason there's less competition today than in the 1990s is the U.S. budget process itself, which makes it difficult to invest in new systems and discourages smaller companies from sticking around to find out whether the political winds in Washington will blow their way.
So the first thing, if I were queen of the world for a day, that Congress could do would be to pass an annual budget. So most Americans, I think, hear that there's a continuing resolution in Congress and the government's averted a shutdown, and isn't that good news? From an innovation perspective, it's terrible news. So whenever Congress can't reach a budget and we're operating on a continuing resolution, it means the Pentagon can spend no new money. That means no new weapons, no new research and development. And so if you're a small company, like a startup here in Silicon Valley, the Pentagon is a terrible customer because Congress doesn't pass a budget. Thousands of very small companies that are key suppliers in the defense industry have left the defense business in the past decade because of this cockamamie budget process that Congress cannot pass an annual budget and can't fund new innovation in the interim.
Perhaps the most important force driving the inertia at the Defense Department today is the premium it puts on avoiding risk at all costs.
The question becomes, is it all necessary? Or are we over flexing on how much risk we're willing to accept? We're like willing to accept no risk. And when I was a chief engineer of a series of space programs back at Raytheon, it was really bad. They wanted not a single shred of risk on the space program. And I would say, I would actually contend that that's what really crippled our space program until SpaceX came around. Is that the zero risk appetite, not control risk, not manage risk, eliminate all risk. That's one of the biggest factors that's slowing down the DoD on these large programs.
But now we live in this world where it's got to be perfect every step of the way. And that means we have excessive costs and very slow acquisition.
Rapidly changing technologies could run up against a military-industrial complex largely focused on what is instead of what will be. And if that weren't enough, we're on the verge of an even more fundamental shift in the dynamics of warfare, the shift to artificial intelligence. The Pentagon's AI-related spending tripled from 2022 to 2023.
I think generative AI, like all technologies, has upside and downside risk. One of the benefits of Gen AI is that it can come up with things that humans would never have imagined. From a tactical perspective in battle, that's a good thing. From a strategic perspective, how are we managing conflict between two countries? It can be very dangerous. I worry a lot that we haven't fully thought through the crisis escalation risks when other countries are adopting generative AI and not thinking through how it could lead us into situations neither side would want.
Whether it's artificial intelligence or swarming drones or any of the many other changes the Pentagon faces, it's more important than ever that we get what we pay for. And looking to the private sector may help show the way. Up next, fighting fire with fire, how tech firms and law enforcement team up to combat cybercrime. That's ahead on Wall Street Week. This is a story about turning the tables, taking the technology criminals exploit to do wrong and using it to bring them to justice.
Unfortunately, human trafficking is as prevalent now as at any other given time we had it in our history.
Timea Nagy runs Timea's Cause, a group that raises awareness about human trafficking, one of the range of crimes using technologies such as electronic money transfers and smartphones to spread around the world. Today, an estimated 28 million people are victims of trafficking. Back in 1998, Nagy was one of those victims herself.
When I was 20 years old, I came to Canada thinking that I'll be a nanny or a babysitter, but unfortunately the employees turned out to be an international human trafficking ring. So I became a victim of human trafficking for 3 months.
Human trafficking, which includes forced labor of all sorts, has grown globally more than 20% in the last 10 years, now amounting to some $236 billion annually. Its spread is built in part on the criminals' use of technology to take and move money and to communicate with those involved, both the victims and the customers. But as large and disturbing as human trafficking is, it's far from the only crime business that's been transformed by tech, prompting law enforcement to ramp up efforts specifically targeting the use of technology to commit crimes.
Because we're located in Silicon Valley, for many years we've devoted tremendous resources to combating high-tech crime, cybercrime.
As the district attorney of Santa Clara, home to Silicon Valley, Jeff Rosen has seen how criminals have innovated alongside technology.
Over the last, 10 to 15 years, the kinds of crimes that we investigated have changed as the criminals have changed the way that they're designing these crimes. So just to give you a sense, when I started as DA about 15 years ago, this high-tech crime task force that we have was basically investigating and prosecuting traditional crimes that involved, say, computers or laptops. So they were only high-tech in the sense that people were stealing massive amounts of computers and laptops and then trying to ship them out of the country, usually to Asia. But very quickly, we saw the kinds of crimes that criminals were committing used the internet.
Criminals have gone way beyond cybercrime and are in all different types of crime that exist against society.
Jonathan Levin has seen the evolution of high-tech crime through his work at his blockchain analysis firm, Chainalysis.
Everything from narcotics trafficking, human trafficking, to terrorist financing, counterproliferation. Really, if you think about it, it's just another means of moving money. And criminals have been early adopters in every type of technology, whether that's the internet or phones. And so, they are also early adopters for the uses of currencies like cryptocurrencies.
You might think that highly sophisticated, tech-literate citizens of Silicon Valley might be less vulnerable to being scammed or exploited online. But Rosen says it may be just the opposite.
A lot of individuals in our county are comfortable in a high-tech setting, and they use social media accounts, and they're comfortable with technology, and they think of themselves as sophisticated individuals, both financially and in their personal and professional lives. And what they don't realize is they're really no match for the psychological techniques that scammers are using, where they're sending out millions of these messages each day.
According to a 2024 NASDAQ report, the full range of transnational illicit activities, including romance scams, business email compromise, and human trafficking, generated over $3 trillion in 2023, with $50 billion alone coming from a scam known as pig butchering, where victims are lured into pouring more and more money into fake investments.
Most of that $50 billion is from the United States. And in terms of what we can specifically trace back to Silicon Valley, we're talking about over the last several years, we're talking from the tens to the hundreds of millions of dollars worth of money that's been stolen from individuals that live in our county and gone to organized crime in Southeast Asia.
Criminals couldn't scale their global efforts without the assistance of technology, but that same technology can also be used to turn the tables and catch the culprits, or if they can't be reached abroad, to get at their ill-gotten gains. In the case of pig butchering, that most often involves Southeast Asia.
One question was, here's a crime that's happening. We're not able to prosecute the perpetrators. Is there anything that our task force should do? And so after discussions with the individuals on our task force, both the prosecutors as well as our local and federal law enforcement, we decided we're going to try to get the victims' money back, as much of it as we can, even if we can't prosecute the perpetrators because they're beyond our reach in Cambodia and Myanmar. And then we set about figuring out how to do that. So we use tools like chain analysis and a tool from TRM Labs to follow money as it moves across the blockchain. And we've gotten very good at tracking money.
It's one thing to detect the criminal, actually search them out, turn them over to law enforcement. It's another thing to get the money back. How often can you get the money back?
Increasingly, it's actually something that we are proactively working on with our private sector clients. If you look at the pig butchering example, it's a problem that is now costing the United States billions of dollars a year. We are identifying that activity and helping map that all the way to the points where money is being laundered. And together with Tether and OKX last year, $225 million of proceeds were seized from the people who were perpetrating these crimes. And eventually, that money can hopefully be returned back to victims. Cryptocurrencies, every single transaction is public. The thing that criminals think is that there is no linkage between their transaction that they've made on that public network. They know that everyone can see it, but they don't think that anyone will be able to link that transaction back to the services that they're using. And actually, at Chainalysis, we've spent the last decade mapping out those addresses to those services and have a very good understanding of all of the ways that people are actually using cryptocurrencies today.
When it comes to human trafficking, it's not so much about getting the money back as it is about locating the victims, using their digital footprints to free them from servitude, and bringing the criminals to justice.
The basic thing is that you need to understand the behavior of human trafficking. So mainly let's talk about domestic sex trafficking, because that's one of the most prevalent type of trafficking in not most, but this is the easiest to detect right now. So you just need to understand how these victims live. What's the lifestyle? They travel all the time, city to city. They don't eat. So once you understand the behavior behind trafficking, then you can basically look at the transactions, and the transactions will show you black and white that this individual is potentially trafficked.
Nagy now works with banks and other financial institutions to find these patterns, using technology they developed to fight fraud and helping law enforcement shut down trafficking operations.
Through transactions, now we can actually prove how human traffickers are trafficking these individuals and how they are the one who's benefiting from this. So we have to prove proceeds of crime, and that's how we would do it.
It's not just individual law enforcement agencies like the Santa Clara DA using technology to fight cybercrime. Increasingly, they're teaming up with other agencies and private sector companies like Chainalysis to attack the problem.
Part of the conferences that we have had about combating cryptocurrency, crypto thefts of money via these online scams is we've invited companies that create products that allow law enforcement to trace the movement of crypto funds as it moves from an individual's bank account to other kinds of exchanges. So Chainalysis and TRM Labs are two of the companies that we have worked with, and partly we're speaking with them about the kinds of tools that we need, the kinds of things that we're seeing that would be most beneficial in the products they make. And part of it is those companies letting us know about techniques that they're seeing for criminals to move money quickly.
We actually managed to bring together the private sector and public sector to work in one room together to look at what are the instances where the private sector has identified some type of fraud, and how does that match to the information that the government has been receiving from victims. And together they use Chainalysis to create the common map of the full life cycle of the fraudulent activity. And that is what the blockchain provides, is that you can see victim funds, you can see where those victim funds end up and where they are being laundered. And the goal is ultimately to hold those people accountable and return money back to victims.
There's an old adage that we're always planning for the last war. Cyber criminals are not only fighting the current war against law enforcement, they're busy planning for the next one. And Levin of Chainalysis, at least, says, bring it on. Rosen and private actors like Chainalysis are getting better than ever at identifying patterns to catch bad actors who use technology to commit fraud.
We actually really like competition, and we think about it as a way for us to leverage all of our technology from the last decade to be able to bring to bear on new problems. And so even if there are new laundering techniques or there's new privacy protocols or things that happen in cryptocurrency, we have mechanisms and strategies about how we can continue to keep up with those adoption curves.
Now, there's a new tool on the horizon that may push law enforcement and the private sector even further in combating cybercrime: artificial intelligence.
Some of the things that we think are going to begin to happen in the future are going to use AI to supercharge this process. So instead of needing hundreds of people to send millions of these messages, maybe you're only going to need, a dozen people to send tens of millions of messages because they're using artificial intelligence. So that's one way that we think the criminals can scale their efforts. Another concern is with advances in technology that allow for things like deep fakes and impersonating people's voices or impersonating what they look like as well as what they sound like. That's going to make the criminals even more effective.
Every powerful tool can be used to do harm or used to do good. And Tamia Nagy sees ways that AI could give her even more power to combat human traffickers.
This is an incredible way to see AI and artificial intelligence and technology coming together to fight such a terrible financial crime, such as human trafficking. And also the fact that as a survival of such a crime, I am so excited to see that there are other technologies and technology in general are coming on board, and we're finally starting to see some real results and starting to deploy real technology to fight such a terrible crimes.
That does it for us here on Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. We'll see you again next week for more stories of capitalism.